Chapter 5. Denmark's History.
This is Christiansborg, and this is where you'll find the Folketing, the Danish parliament. More than 150 years ago, Denmark wrote its first free constitution, and in so doing became a democracy. The man you see on the horse is King Frederik VII. He's the king who, in 1849, signed the constitution of the Kingdom of Denmark, the Grundlov, the country's first democratic constitution. In several other European countries, this kind of event led to violent revolutions, but in Denmark, under strong pressure from the people, the king agreed to relinquish his power after almost 200 years of autocratic rule. Thus, the king turned over power to representatives elected by the people, but the king continued to be the country's head of state.
Denmark's first king lived during the Viking Age more than 1,000 years ago. His name was Gorm the Old. Gorm the Old's son, Harald Bluetooth, erected a famous stone. The inscription on the stone states that Harald brought Christianity to the Danes and is written in runes, the written language of the Vikings. The stone is known as Denmark's birth certificate.
So it was more than 1,000 years ago that the Vikings became Christians and bade farewell to their old gods Odin and Thor. Viking ships were very seaworthy, enabling them to sail across vast distances to conquer nations, plunder and trade in foreign lands. Here in Roskilde Cathedral, many Danish kings and queens are buried. One of them is Queen Margrethe I. She ruled the country and gathered the Nordic countries Denmark, Norway and Sweden into the Kalmar Union. That was in 1397. Back then, the Danish church was part of the rich and powerful Catholic Church. But in 1536, the Danish church broke away from the papacy in Rome and became the Evangelical Lutheran Church, on which today's national church, the Folkekirke, is founded.
Christian IV is probably one of the most well-known kings in Denmark's history. He was a great developer who made his mark on Copenhagen with a large number of buildings. He reigned as king for 60 years until his death in 1648. The Danish monarchy is over 1,000 years old and is one of the oldest in the world. The Danish monarchy has changed a great deal in the course of time.
Christian IV's son, Frederik III, introduced what is called an absolute monarchy, a time where the king had total power and could decide everything. Absolute monarchy was introduced in 1661. The year before, Frederik III had executed a coup d'état, which meant that the crown was to be handed down from one generation to the next. Until that time, the king had been elected by a national council. The absolute monarchy lasted for almost 200 years. During the absolute monarchy in the 1700s, Denmark was, however, influenced by new European thoughts and ideas about freedom and rights for the individual. The Liberty Memorial is a monument to a pivotal event in 1788, when farmers gained their freedom. Previously, the farmers were forced to work without pay for estate owners. Following this event, the farmers could now freely choose whether they wanted to remain on the estate or leave. They also gained the option of owning their own land. These new thoughts and ideas about freedom and rights for the individual led to the introduction of democracy in 1849.
Throughout the 1700s, Denmark kept out of the big wars that swept through the rest of Europe, and in the same period, great sums of money were earned in trading and shipping. But in the 1800s, more wars followed that had significant consequences for Denmark. First against England and later against Germany. In 1814, Denmark lost Norway, which at the time was a part of Denmark. And in 1864, Denmark had to relinquish almost a third of its remaining territory to Germany. In 1920, some of these areas were reunited with Denmark. This occurred after a referendum in which the population was asked if they wanted to belong to Denmark or to Germany. The last half of the 1800s was characterized by great changes throughout Europe. This applied to Denmark as well. During the industrial age, many people moved from rural to urban areas to become industrial workers. This period was characterized by new thoughts and ideas in which strong political movements originated that changed society, and which still continue to play an important role today. The workers' movement, which included many unions, fought for better conditions for workers. The cooperative movement fought for conditions for farmers. And there was the folk school movement, which fought for the right to education and information for everyone. During World War I, Denmark remained neutral. But in 1939, World War II broke out. And Denmark was occupied by German troops in 1940. Denmark, however, was not as fiercely hit by World War II compared to the majority of other countries in Europe. The final years of the occupation were characterized by acts of sabotage, strikes, and resistance against the Germans. The flight of Danish Jews to Sweden has a special place in Danish history. At the beginning of the war, about 8,000 Jews lived in Denmark. By far the majority managed to flee to neutral Sweden and thus avoided death in concentration camps. Denmark was liberated on the 5th of May 1945. This day is still celebrated by flying flags on buses and on official buildings. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Danes became wealthier. Unemployment fell, and agricultural and industrial production rose annually. During this period, the welfare society that we know today began to be established. For example, laws on social insurance covering illness, maternity leave, and unemployment were passed. At the end of the 1960s, there was a shortage of labor, and the first guest workers arrived in Denmark. The majority came from the former Yugoslavia, Pakistan, and Turkey. Women also rushed out onto the labor market. The state took over many of the tasks previously performed by women, among them caring for the elderly, the sick, and children.
Christianias største våben, det arbejdshæren. Arbejdshæren lover til enhver tid.
At the end of the 1960s and far into the 1970s, a number of anti-authoritarian movements made a mark on Danish society, with inspiration from abroad. For example, students wanted to have a say at their places of study. Women went to the barricades and challenged the gender roles and the traditional forms of cohabitation they had been raised with. The Youth Rebellion, as it is sometimes called, has had significant influence on how society is organized, for example, with regard to education, gender roles, and work.
Kong Frederik den 9. er død. Længe leve hendes majestæt, dronning Margrethe den anden.
In 1972, Denmark's King Frederik IX died. His daughter was declared a successor and is currently the country's monarch, Her Royal Highness Queen Margrethe II. A year later, in 1973, Denmark became a member of the European Community, following a referendum. In the same year, the first of the global oil crises began, thus ending many years of optimism. The 1980s were characterized by high unemployment and recession. But in the 1990s, the economy once again began to look brighter. Besides membership in the European Union, Denmark currently cooperates closely with other Scandinavian countries. But Denmark's international connections reach further than just its neighbours. For many years, Denmark has been a significant contributor to the United Nations system. And since 1949, Denmark has been a member of the defence and military alliance NATO.